Hey everyone, welcome to Writing Critiques. This is a channel where you can submit your writing for honest feedback. For this first episode, I'll be doing my own writing for critique, and it'll be an intro chapter from a early work that I started maybe 2 years ago. So this is an opportunity for me to show you what I do by trial by fire, I guess. Let's switch to the potato cam.
Okay, here we are. So the reason I call this the potato cam is because, well, my laptop is a weird size and we're using a Microsoft Surface. Also, for some reason, while I'm using OBS, which is the program I'm using to record these videos, you get this weird hitching when I'm in full screen mode on Scrivener, which is annoying and strange. Either way, this is a temporary solution and what I'll be going with for now until I get a better lighting setup. But with that said, let's move on to it. So the intent of this channel is to provide a honest feedback for writing. And yes, it's going to be on video. I've already had questions regarding whether I'll do it in private. No, this is a YouTube channel. The entire point is to do it on video. But that isn't to say that I'm planning to just eviscerate people on video for the laughs. That is not the intent of this channel. The channel itself is just to provide honest feedback. And by honest feedback, I mean I'm going to be splitting my feedback generally into two main categories, storycraft and wordcraft. When I say writing critiques, I primarily mean creative writing. So anything from a script to a poem to a piece of like an episode from a novel or a short story or flash fiction, which is like short fiction. Anything like that, I'm happy to have a look at it and critique it. The critique I'll be providing will be long form, and the first thing I'll do is I'll read out the section that you've asked me to read out, or I've established that I will read out. No longer than 1,000 words, because I don't want these videos to be hours long. And after I read out that section, I'll be providing feedback, either in depth or otherwise, depending on what's necessary for that piece. But let's go back to the things I mentioned before: storycraft and wordcraft. So I think that those are just a good, broad, general categories that anyone who is looking for feedback probably wants some indication of. So what I mean by each. Storycraft would be the actual story you're portraying. And again, I mostly do creative fiction. So if you're introducing a novel, I would just be rating the quality of your introduction, whether you hook the reader, whether you have a good sense of setting, a good sense of character, whether your scene is active and therefore gets people engaged, whether you're showing versus telling. That's all storycraft. Then you have wordcraft on the other side of things, which is sentence structure. I'm personally not a grammar Nazi. I don't really care about punctuation all too much, but I will point it out if it's really egregious to the point where even I notice it. Like if I notice it, a lot of people will, because I just don't personally care too much about that stuff. Then there's the actual activeness or passiveness of your sentences. And I'm actually not personally that great at picking out active versus passive sentence structure and then word usage. But what I am good at picking out is whether you're conveying the activity of the scene through your sentence structure. So if there's a sentence that runs on too long and uses a lot of and is just worded poorly to the point where you can't tell what's happening, or you're not conveying the pacing of your scene through that wording, that sentence structure. Usually that's because you're using passive voice, but I'll be pointing out from the opposite perspective of this sentence isn't doing its work. I won't be saying, oh, this is passive voice and you cannot use it. And sometimes there's place for passive voice, even though it should be eliminated as much as possible. It doesn't have to be. So that's the broad strokes of what I'll be doing here. Storycraft, wordcraft, overall feedback, and as honest as possible, which means giving you praise as well as giving you criticism where it's warranted. I really doubt a lot of these will be just a complete evisceration. And if they are, hey, but honestly, like, I don't think most people's writing is absolutely terrible. Sometimes you have people who are really terrible at the wordcraft part of it, but can actually really tell a good yarn. And that's sometimes the funnest stuff to read, and to critique. Also, I am not a person who is easily impressed by really flowery words. So Guy Gabriel Kay, who's a really famous writer nowadays, Taigana, known for the beauty of his word usage, etc. Personally, he's not my bag. Like, I prefer someone along the lines of like a detective fiction writer or someone with the sentences are short and snappy and that kind of stuff. But overall, let's go back to the critique. Storycraft, wordcraft, and those critiques will be couched within an overall essentially window of what is your goal. So the only thing I really need from you when you submit to me work, or when a friend submits to me work, is what is the goal of the scene that you're submitting. In general, it'll be pretty obvious. Like if it's an introduction chapter, there's pretty defined goals for an introduction chapter, which is pretty much just set up a setting, hook the reader, preferably give a sense of character and action. Or at least, and by action I don't mean shooting guns, I mean like things happening that you want to see unfold. Those are pretty defined settings. But if it's something like a piece of dialogue, for example, where this is in your book is something that would be really important to know. What the scene is intended to do, like which character do you want to establish by the scene. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. Which character do you want to establish by the scene? What do you want out of the scene? Like, what do you want the reader to feel out of the scene? Like, whether you want to feel sympathy or hatred or annoyance, like that kind of stuff. Whether your goal is, will establish whether the storycraft and wordcraft are working in your favor or against your favor. Some things are just bad. Like, for example, really, really poor punctuation to even the point where I notice it is bad, no matter what your goal is. But generally, things like even a hook, like for example, chapter 23. Does not need the same level of hook as chapter 1. Almost in no other chapters need the same amount of hook as a chapter 1. But with all that said, let's focus back on what you see on screen. This is my writing from 2 years ago. This is the first. I think this is actually the first thing I ever wrote with the intent of writing. Like what I mean by this is like outside of a high school assignment or a university assignment. When I'm actually sitting down on my own time and decided to write something, this was the first thing I ever wrote. I have no idea how good or bad it is, and I'm only going to do, because I haven't used a lot of time on that intro, for this episode of Writing Critiques, I will only be doing these first 3 paragraphs. So from here to around here. So I'm still getting used to this touchscreen as a new laptop, but you get the point. So from night to buttoning it. So I'll read it out first, so I can get an overall sense for the thing, and you can get an idea of what I'm critiquing, and then I'll probably go back and dissect it a little bit. And this will probably take a couple of takes for me to do because I'm not the best reader, but I'll try to have a version that's readable in the video. So here we go. Chapter 1. Night still blanketed the worn cobbled streets of Embrace as a man furtively paced along Hammer's Row. This city's buildings have a bad habit of looming, he thought, the leather cord of his pack creaking from the strain of his nervous grip in the frigid winter air. At least it doesn't snow in this part of the world. Nathan wasn't quite sure if the uneasiness he was feeling was indeed because of the buildings themselves, or because he just had a bad feeling about today in general. The densely packed storefronts either side of him were 2 stories tall on average and a mixture of brick and stone. Despite their obvious age, they stood perfectly straight and still showed clear signs of excellent workmanship. Overall, the buildings couldn't really be described as looming at all, and if Nathan was being perfectly honest with himself, they had never shown any signs of conspiring against him. Upon coming to this realization, his eyes widened and he quickened his pace. As he hurried down the street, store windows of many sizes reflected a man in his mid-20s, with a medium build, slightly less than average height, and sharp facial features. The frost-covered glass didn't quite capture his light brown skin, dark hair, or rare amber-colored eyes, but his reflection certainly did capture his oddly disheveled appearance. His hair, normally kept in a short, tidy cut, was an unruly mop. He also had a beard which served as a case in point as to why he usually avoided one. To top it all off, his dark winter coat sat oddly on his frame, its wearer clearly having been half asleep when buttoning it. Okay, that didn't really say much. Let's keep going for 2 more paragraphs. Much like Nathan, the street along which he walked had certainly seen better days. Patches of mud and grit marred the cracked stone beneath Hammer's Row. In truth, it was little more than a wagonway, and yet had the misfortune of serving as a combined multi-lane thoroughfare and pedestrian walkway. It was for this reason that Nathan had made a habit of rising early, generally preferring to avoid near-death experiences before his morning coffee. Thankfully, at this time of day, the golden glow of the gas street lamps only provided illumination to a small stream of men and women as they ventured forth through the early morning frost. Hammers Row wound its way from Nathan's home district, one of many run-down areas of Southern Embrace, northwest through West Carter's district, before ending at a stand road. It was at this intersection that his daily destination lay, but this morning the normally half-hour journey felt like it was taking an eternity. He hadn't felt this kind of uneasiness for what may as well have been a lifetime, and the last time he felt it, he had died. Nathan abruptly stopped and turned around, surveying the street behind him. There was no one around for a good 50 paces, and none of the pedestrians he could see showed any signs of interest in him. All the same, the feeling in the center of his chest didn't lessen. His hand fell to hover near his belt, but then he remembered that the old familiar weight wasn't there anymore. He shook himself and turned around, feeling foolish. As Nathan turned, he caught a glimpse of himself, between large stenciled letters proclaiming the store next to him, apparently named Zico Shoe Palace, had the best prices in all West Carter's district. True father's beard, he swore. Okay, let's stop it there. Let's get into the critique. So, again, primary categories, storycraft and wordcraft. But before I get to that, I'll give my overall thoughts for the first 5 or so paragraphs. This was thankfully less terrible than I thought it would be for my own personal writing. It's not great. It's not bad though. Definitely at least readable. Some parts where I stumbled, and some parts where maybe the sentences were a bit too long, etc. But overall, in terms of giving a sense of character and a sense of place, it did achieve quite a lot, which I'm thankful for, because I didn't want to eviscerate my own work. At least I don't know if my ego could really take that. Anyway, so we've got the overall category of storycraft would include whether it has a hook, does it give a sense of place/setting, and does it have a sense of character, and is it an active scene? So in this scene, it is active. So he is moving down walking down a road, walking down Hammers Row or Hammers Way, whichever I named it, towards Stand Road. And so that's essentially where you're catching this guy, and he's walking around furtively for some reason. He has an uneasy feeling for some reason. He is clearly unsure if he's being followed. Let's see if I can get down to that part. When he abruptly stops and turns around, that all gives a sense of being followed. So there is some sense of mystery here, and he is somewhat being active, but this is very different from a scene, for example, where he'd be actively doing something with a clear goal. What I mean by that is walking somewhere is a defined goal, and it is active, but it is clearly not a particularly demonstrative goal. Like, that doesn't really tell you anything about him. Like, for example, he's going, I know because I wrote this thing, that he's going towards his workshop, where he, or his shop in general, where he makes clocks. That's this character's thing. But it would be far more demonstrative for him to be in his office, for example, making a clock. That would tell you far more about this character, and you can have the scene goal be, does he complete the clock he's working on, or does he finish fixing the clock he works on? And then you can have that all happen. Of course, when you do something like that, you avoid other elements of the scene that this is building up. So that actually gets me to the hook. Because whether a scene is active and whether it has a hook is actually very intertwined. Frequently, the action of a scene, and that again doesn't have to be shooting guns, it can be simply something as simple as putting together a watch. Whether a scene is active can hook a reader in and of itself, but there's other ways to hook a reader. And in this one, I think I was going more for the world building path. So if you look at something along the lines of The Wheel of Time, or even Harry Potter to a lesser extent, J.K. Rowling and J.R.R. Martin, Robert Jordan, their approach towards hooking the reader is to create a world that you want to see more of. So Hogwarts is obviously an example of that. But in the first pages of Harry Potter, it's more about the world of witchcraft and wizardry. It is Dumbledore unlighting lights along a quiet suburban street, or in the case of Robert Jordan, it is the destruction of the old age and the creation of Dragonmount. So in those cases, it is a case of world building. And in fact, with Robert Jordan's case, in The Wheel of Time, you pretty much have no idea what's going on for the first whole section of that chapter. And it is also, I think it was Moradin, I'm not sure what his name, he goes Samael or Ishamael. I forget which of the bad guys you are following at the start. But it's the main bad guy, aside from the Dark One itself. But he's just walking through in that scene, he is walking through a house or a castle that's just being blown apart, essentially, or totally wrecked. And that's all it is. He's just looking around and walking, and then he finds an old man. He makes fun of the old man, and then the old man goes away, kills himself, and makes a mountain out of his own corpse. That's the starting of the Wheel of Time. So in that case, the actual scene itself isn't particularly active until it gets to the part where he's talking to the old man. But the world building established, so the words he uses, the sense of lore or hidden lore he brings up with naming things, as this man's walking through a castle looking at tapestries and all that kind of stuff. That is the hook he's establishing in the first chapter, or in that case, the prologue of The Wheel of Time. For Harry Potter, it's very similar. Like, again, well, in that case, she does a bit of a better job because unless I'm being crazy, I might be wrong here, but I swear it starts with Dumbledore. Or at least it does in the movies. Let's just go with the movie example, unless I'm being crazy. Maybe if you consider that the starting of your book, you have Dumbledore appearing, walking through a street, and taking out lights as he goes along. He's clearly going somewhere, but the part that's interesting is the fact that someone appeared in a quiet suburban street and is able to put out lights with a little lighter, essentially. That is the world building hook. And in very effective, like in both of those cases. In the TV version of Game of Thrones, it's also similar. The first scene of that is the White Walkers. To be fair, it's kind of cheating because the actual scene itself is very active with people running away, I think it was, from some threat, and you don't know what it is. And then it turns out that there's White Walkers and they die. That's the opening of Game of Thrones. So in those cases, yeah, an active scene is very linked to whether it has a hook. And in this case, I was going for the world building hook, but I don't think I really nailed it here. So Night Still Blanketed the Worn Cobbled Streets of Embrace. So it's that kind of Victorian era setting, if not modern, with set in an old place, but probably close to a Victorian era setting. I mentioned gas lamps down here. I mentioned gas lamps, and that's kind of where you get like the overall. Okay, this is most likely, almost definitely Victorian kind of era. In fact, I mentioned wagons and that kind of thing. So the whole era is set somewhat, but the fact that nothing much is happening, I'm only really describing the world around him. He himself isn't particularly interesting, and he's not really doing anything interesting. In fact, the only part where I personally, now going back to this years later, got hooked was when he pauses and stops and turns around to see if he was being chased, and then there's an old familiar weight in his belt, and he doesn't have it anymore. That was the first time I actually personally felt hooked. I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. So he's being chased by something, or he might be being chased by something, he isn't sure what. But he's used to having, in this case, most likely a gun, but he doesn't have one anymore. That kind of, for me, was the first real hook. And that brings me to what a hook really is. And a hook is pretty much just open questions you pose to the reader. You can have it as broad as that. It is, why doesn't Nathan have a gun? Or will X person survive through this scene? Or what is the Philosopher's Stone? Like some hooks can be in the title of your novel, for example. What are the White Walkers? Or will the kingdoms fall to the White Walkers, and why is everyone scared of them? That's established later on, but you get the idea. It is an open question to the scene, to the reader, and that can be, why is there a wizard in the normal Muggle world in Harry Potter? And I'll use those. I can think of so many more examples, but I'm not going to keep going into them. But the idea is you establish open questions to the reader, or brackets, depending on how you like it to define them. I personally like the Brandon Sanderson method defining a hook. And if you establish hooks, that is a good way to make someone want to keep reading. Open questions with satisfying answers is the core of Storycraft. And in this, I don't really establish one. I just essentially establish the world. I have a decent sense of place and setting. I'll give myself that in terms of the elements of Storycraft that deserve critiquing. I have a decent sense of place and setting. It's cold. I like this sentence quite a lot. The leather cord, that's the second sentence here. The leather cord of his pack creaking from the strain of his nervous grip in the frigid winter air. Like that was, I think I did quite a bit of heavy lifting, which I like quite a lot. It's quite concrete in the terms of when people think of a leather cord of his pack. A pack is an interesting way to refer to a backpack, and it gives you a certain mental picture, and the fact that the cord is leather gives you a certain mental picture, and the fact that it's creaking because of the strain of his nervous grip is a very defined mental picture, and frigid winter air, defined mental picture. So I like overall from start, like almost from start to finish, that sentence there is very concrete and does quite a bit of heavy lifting. And by heavy lifting, I mean achieving a lot of things in a single sentence. So in this case, I'm establishing the weather, which is part of the setting. I'm establishing that he's nervous, which is part of the scene, and establishing the cord of his pack, which is also part of the setting. But because I wrote this thing, I also know that pack is very important because there's stuff inside it. So like important plot stuff inside it. So essentially that sentence is very strong. But overall, like, yeah, I don't think I really hook the reader outside of okay wordcraft and a good sense of setting until I get to the gun stuff later, and which gives you more questions about the actual character. So the next section of critique I'll go into is sense of character, which is another requirement, I believe, of an intro chapter, and that's the kind of critique I'm doing here. So an intro chapter needs to give you a good sense of, it should, in my opinion, give you a good sense of character. It doesn't actually matter if the character is in, like, the main character of your book, or only in this one scene. Either way, it has to actually provide an emotional hook to the reader. It grounds the reader in a person's shoes, and they can experience the world through that person's eyes. And you can only really do that if you have a good sense of character. And by sense of character, you don't even have to like them. In fact, frequently it works quite well if you hate them. In my writers group this past weekend, there was a lady who read out a piece of work that with a detestable main character in it, and everyone loved it because you had a good sense of who that person was. And part of reading is escapism and getting to other people's shoes. So having a good sense of character is, I think, really important, but also ultimately not necessary. And it comes back to goals. A goal for an intro chapter is to hook the reader. That is the number one goal. And if you're writing sci-fi, for example, sometimes you can start with, in the year 2182, humans no longer required bodies. And you can have something like that and go through like the next couple of paragraphs not having a single character involved, just explaining the fact that, holy shit, people don't need bodies anymore. And in doing so, that can be your hook, because it opens up so many questions about whether someone needs, like, what kind of world would that create if no one needed bodies, if everyone was digitized into some form of matrix, for example. But then other people would argue that if you did that same thing but did it in a character's shoes, experiencing it, like, for example, someone being scanned into a computer and sitting on a table with a doctor in front of him explaining to him that this is the system that they've created. They're going to scan you into the computer, and you're no longer going to have a body, but you won't need it ever again. That kind of scene establishes the same setting, but in the character's shoes. So you can argue either way, but overall, I think the only real requirement is to hook the reader. That said, though, if you can establish a sense of character, personally, I think that's an advantage. And in this, I think I pretty much don't do a great job here. I describe him physically, for example. Store windows of many sizes reflected a man in his mid-20s with a medium build, slightly less than average height, and sharp facial features. There's nothing there that's... I do describe him, but there's nothing there that's particularly memorable. Medium build is like saying average. Slightly less than average height may as well be average. And sharp facial features. So sharp facial features is probably the only thing there that's remotely descriptive, like, to be honest. And then light brown skin, dark hair, or rare amber colored eyes. That's better. That's actually okay. That gives you... okay, so this guy is probably like a eastern, southeastern kind of look, which actually conflicts with the frost and gas lamps kind of feeling. So it's an Indian dude in Britain, potentially circa Victorian era. That gives you some form of like a interesting hook there. But the first sentence of it with mid-20s, medium build, slightly less than average height, and sharp facial features, like that I think mostly fails. But then you have a beard. He has a beard and short, like hair short. Like a lot of these are not interesting details. Like they're details, and for some people they might need them. But for many people, you pretty much just need. Like if I described him as, for example, scrappy with amber eyes and short, messy hair, that kind of almost does this entire thing. In a scrappy Indian man with amber eyes and short, messy hair. That's almost the entire paragraph. And I instead waste an entire paragraph of it and don't really deliver anything particularly interesting. But that's certainly visual appearance. And that isn't even what I really mean by sense of character. A sense of character is primarily like, who is this person? And the first time you hear from him is in this interior dialogue or interior monologue. Or thoughts as the city's buildings have a bad habit of looming. At least it doesn't snow in this part of the world. For that, it doesn't. Honestly, this city's buildings have a bad habit of looming. He thought, being nervous. That actually, for me, establishes him as pretty weak. He is, unless he's like kind of a jokey kind of character, which he is, and I could do better at establishing that in this. I could definitely do better at establishing that in this freaking first 5 paragraphs. Like it doesn't really establish that he's jokey till much later. Like he's joking to himself about this fact, and that the reader doesn't know that at all. The reader just thinks he's kind of complaining. At least it doesn't slow in this part of the world. Again, he's complaining. That's not really establishing. If it is establishing character, it's establishing a complainer, which definitely doesn't reek of main character material. The only time, again, that I really established his character, and probably why it also hooked me, is these parts here. He hadn't really felt this kind of uneasiness. That's here. He hadn't really felt this kind of uneasiness for it may as well have been a lifetime. And the last time he felt it, he died. And I shouldn't have. He had died, but I will get to the word crop in a bit. Nathan rapidly stopped and turned around, surveying the street behind him. There was no one around for a good 50 paces, and none of the pedestrians he could see showed any signs of interest in him. All the same, the feeling in the center of his chest didn't lessen. His hand fell over to hover near his belt, and then he remembered that the old familiar weight wasn't there anymore. He shook himself and turned around, feeling foolish. So that part establishes a character. Okay, so this is a guy who is pretty active in a dangerous situation. So he surveys the street. He doesn't just run or hide or anything like that. He stops with the intent to fight. And then he hand fell to hover over his belt. So his first inclination is to reach for a gun, essentially, or something similar. Like it could be a wand. Who knows? You don't know in this universe. I know it's a gun because I wrote it. So his hand falls to hover his gun, and then it's not there anymore, and so he shook himself, feeling foolish. So that establishes who the character is in a pretty decent way. Or at least it gives you an idea. Like maybe you're leaning more towards a complainer but a gunslinger, which is again not really great because I wanted to have like a cool kind of feeling to him, but I don't really establish that very well. And the rest of the scene doesn't really establish a character at all. So it's pretty much just describing the world around him as if through a narrator's eyes. So, for example, the densely packed storefronts either side of him were 2 stories tall on average. This is this section here. 2 stories tall on average with a mixture of brick and stone. Despite their obvious age, they stood perfectly straight and still showed clear signs of excellent workmanship. Overall, the buildings couldn't really be described as looming at all, and if Nathan was being honest with himself, they had never shown any signs of conspiring against him. That part sounds like a narrator delving into Nathan's mind a little bit, but pretty much just coldly describing the world around. It's very different to seeing a world through a character's eyes, where you'd have his opinions of everything as it goes along. So it could be like Nathan surveyed, or Nathan glanced at the closest of the 2 buildings, noting the missing bricks. The well-cut bricks and perfectly clear windows. Then have some interior pieces of monologues like, well kept. Probably not, I don't know, any bandits lurking nearby. So like you have an interior monologue, you have a interplay between personal observations and description. That's how you essentially do a description in a character's, from a character's viewpoint. But this is very much more like a narrator describing a scene to the reader, and that makes it pretty cold. So the overall, I don't really establish a good sense of character in general. So in terms of storycraft as a whole, I think it's pretty, it's average. It doesn't do great, it doesn't do poorly. Establishes a world, it has some open questions. It doesn't really hook the reader, in my opinion, unless someone is grabbed by the wordcraft and the world building, the minimal world building I'm doing here. It's a active scene, but not very active. And the activeness of it doesn't really tell you anything about the character until he goes for his gun, and that's quite a few paragraphs down. And does it show versus tell? I think it shows versus tells. I think that part of it is okay. It doesn't do great, it doesn't do poorly. Like, for example, when he reaches for a gun, that's definitely showing versus telling. The throwaway line of the last time he'd had this feeling he died, that's a good hook to go forward, but that's all the way down there past this page. So overall, it's kind of, I don't know, meh. So I think storycraft's, yeah, okay, not great, not terrible. Let's go to wordcraft. Sentence structure, I think I generally did pretty well here, mostly because I didn't stumble too much as I read it, and that's a good indication. The best way to know if you have good wordcraft overall is to read it out loud to yourself. And I don't mean whisper it to yourself while mostly reading it in your head. I mean actually trying to read it out loud. And if you can do that without stumbling as you go through, that'll tell you whether you have good sentence flow and structure to a greater degree. Punctuation, I'm generally fine. I'm using italics here for interior monologue, and I stick to that as I go through, so that's not terrible. I don't have too many examples here of where I could have changed it, and I bet some grammar Nazis can definitely pick out things which should have been semicolons, for example, and that kind of stuff. That's really not what I'm personally worried about. It's whether it's readable or not, and I think overall the punctuation there is pretty good. And then we come to, I think, the last part of wordcraft, which is pretty important, which is the style of writing. And that is short, sharp, and succinct versus longer, more eloquent. And the way that Brandon Sanderson describes this, and I think it's actually him, I think it's someone he cribs this from, but it's the window pane. Some writing you come to for the beauty of the window. What I mean by that is, picture it like the story is on the other side of the window and you're on the interior of the window and you're looking through the window at the story. And some people come to writing for the beauty of the window itself. Like the window is stained glass, for example. That's to say that the writing that tells you the story is in itself beautiful. And the story is somewhat second to that. And kind of has to be, because within limited space, you're either focusing on the writing or the story, really, primarily. Other types of writing makes the window transparent. So you're just looking at the story, and the writing itself doesn't really matter. It's very short, sharp, succinct. It's just there to deliver the information that the author wants you to know through the story itself. And that spectrum from clear window to stained glass window is a good analogy for very flowery writing on the stained glass side to very simple 6-inch writing on the clear side. And for this, I'm leaning pretty much somewhere in the middle, somewhere where I still have these long sentences and I still drop words like apparently, and then I still drop words like indeed, and a couple things like that. And in some ways that helps if you're in an epic fantasy mode, but you can do epic fantasy with a very clear window pane. Window glass. And Brandon Sanderson leans towards that direction. He's a good example of that in the near term. But if you look at early Robert Jordan works, that's very much in the closer to a stained glass window. And Guy Gabriel Kay is the current leading figure in that part. And Rothfuss is also somewhere in the middle as well. So this is along the lines of a Rothfuss level of beauty. Like the words aren't individually that amazing. The sentence structure isn't particularly complex or impressive. It is quite transparent, but there are the flecks here and there of style that set it apart from something that's a very transparent work, like a detective novel, for example. So overall, I think that it fits, the wordcraft fits the tone. It's not terrible, and therefore it's possible. I like it. It's not bad. There's not too much passive voice there. I think I caught a couple of examples. There's no real point in going back and pointing them out. But the overall thoughts of it is storycraft, average, wordcraft, okay. Overall, like, considering this is my first work, again, I'm happy that it wasn't anywhere near as terrible as I had worried it was when I started this video. I think it's definitely not like, it's something I'd only read if I had nothing else to read. Like that's kind of my rating for my own work so far. But it's definitely not something I'd throw out because it's so shit. So that is writing critiques. That's an example of what a critique of writing is. On this channel, and overall that's what I hope to convey for you guys and to help you out, and so we can all grow as writers together. That is, after all, the overall desire for this channel. It's not to totally break people apart and hurt their work. It's to just provide constructive feedback, overall feedback, and examples of good work, bad work. Like, for example, I still point out that this second sentence here is pretty damn good, and if I could do more like that in this work, I think it'd elevate the whole thing. But also bad work, like this description here, which is pretty average, and to be able to do that for writers as I go along, and hopefully help everyone get better together. So with that, thank you for watching Writing Critiques episode 1. I've gone through my trial of fire, hopefully mostly unscathed, and hopefully you guys can do the same. So submit your writing to yourwritingcritiques@gmail.com if you want to see it on screen with my words behind it. And I hope you enjoy the video. Like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.